though. I'm going to argue that raising minimum wage is actually not necessary because it actually happens naturally over time. It doesn't actually fix the inequality between, provide opportunity, and ultimately it hurts the workers that it claims to want to help, which is the poor. So in this, minimum wage was never meant to be like a stable job where you work it full time and that's where you make all of your money from. It was supposed to be a starting point. This is why so many teenagers started off with minimum wage jobs. It's why we go to college and we work minimum wage jobs. We go to college to try to get a better education, to be able to make more. So James Shirk, a research fellow in labor economics at the Heritage Foundation, claims that minimum wage does not need to rise for minimum wage employees to get a raise. 2/3 of minimum wage workers make above the minimum wage a year later. And this happens because most minimum wage jobs are entry-level positions. They teach unskilled and inexperienced workers basic employment skills. Without these skills, they can't qualify for higher paying jobs. As they acquire these skills, they become more productive and command higher pay. So rather than mandating the government or mandating employers to force them to pay higher, it should be up to the workers to give them incentive to want to work hard to get the money for it, rather than forcing workers to do it. So another part says that by the study, says raising the minimum wage reduces the availability of these entry-level jobs, making it harder for less skilled employees to acquire the experience necessary to move up. A minimum wage increase would hurt the very workers Congress wants to help. Econometricians have determined that employers respond to minimum wage increases primarily by reducing hiring rather than laying off existing employees. Many of them whom would soon earn a raise regardless, they get a lack of hours instead. Over a 5-year period, it's projected that a 10% increase in the minimum wage would actually reduce the total employment by 1.2%. So to benefit from a higher minimum wage, you must first have a job. And for many untrained young people, the 15 hourly minimum wage is an unsurmountable barrier. Why would any employer hire an untrained, inexperienced person for $15 an hour when an older, more experienced worker are pounding the pavement looking for work? An article in the Washington Post claims that the real minimum wage is $0 and requiring employers to pay above market rates will sadly increase the number of low-skilled citizens receiving this zero wage. So people increase it to try to get more work, but rather than increasing work, it causes people to be jobless, which really just takes it back to being $0 again. So basically, if you have a lower minimum wage, it's better to have work than to have no work. Employers will rationally respond by hiring fewer workers and increasing their investments in later saving automation. Higher wages for low-skilled employers require an increase in the productivity of low-skilled employees, not noble-sounding legislation. With the $15 minimum wage, they just shoot at a number. Rather than doing the studies behind it, why raise it to 15? Why not just keep it where we are now? There was a study we know from experience in Seattle. They raised it to, they were doing the 15 minimum wage experiment, so a professor from Harry J. Holzer, professor at McCourt School of Policy at Georgetown, claims, I have much more serious worries about a 15 minimum wage, which constitutes a wage increase of 50% to 100% in most places, even after adjusting for inflation. In cities like Seattle, with a relatively more educated workforce and dynamic labor market, it might be a gamble we're taking. But in other cities, such as LA and Washington DC, with their large populations of less educated workers, including unskilled immigrants, such increases are extremely risky. When they put out this, when in 2015 in Seattle, when they started paying employers $11 an hour, it was fine. But once they raised it to $13 an hour, this actually caused negative effects. It actually caused workers to have a decrease in over $100 per month. So they lost hours, they lost money when the wages went up. And so rather than shooting for 15, just like keep it, they were fine at 11. So for in California, it would be more useful to keep it at 10.50. So the answer is not to mandate higher wages, but to free private sector employers from crushing taxes and costly regulations so they can expand and create the good paying jobs millions of Americans want and need. The increases of up to $15 are much greater in magnitude than anything we have studied in the past. Because of this, it's hard to say that previous research has found modest negative effects on employment, but a whole true and reasonable guess is that effects now will be much more negative. And ultimately, with poor workers, it might take time for employers of many low-skilled workers to learn how to economize on their labor costs, but they will over time, since the incentives to do so are much larger, and that would be bad news for very low-skilled workers with the higher minimum wages designed to help, because then they'll be out of a job when automation comes in.